Good and welcome, everyone. This is a time of year when we see chocolate bunny rabbits and Easter eggs everywhere. Often we see them placed on artificial grass in a basket, the whole thing wrapped in cellophane, ready for sale. As a child, my family would also purchase egg dyeing kits and dye our farm's chicken eggs different colors. Remember doing that? And of course, many would get up early on Easter Sunday to attend an Easter sunrise service. Now we're told that all of these traditions somehow relate to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Do they? Now in John 4, verse 23, Jesus tells us that his true worshipers shall worship in spirit and in truth. That's what all true Christians should do. We should worship our Creator in spirit and in truth. So today, let's take a look at the holiday of Easter. Is observing Easter a commandment from God, or is it a commandment of man? And does it matter? Recently, we saw that adding to God's commandments and or taking away from God's commandments is prohibited in our Bibles. We can read that in Deuteronomy 4, verse 2, and in Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 and 19. And according to the passages in Revelation 12, there will be some serious negative consequences to those who do add to or take away from God's commandments. So first, is Easter something that was commanded by God, or was it added to the worship of our Creator? If indeed Easter is commanded to be kept in our Bibles, it should be easy to find. But the word Easter never appears in the Bible. Nor does the Bible speak of any of the traditions of Easter in the worship of the one true God. No, not even a single one. Nowhere in our Bibles do we see that bunny rabbits, Easter eggs, or an Easter sunrise service have anything to do with the worship of the one true God. Now, those using the most widely read English translation of the Bible, the 1611 King James Bible, they may argue that the word Easter does appear in Acts 12, verse 4 in their King James Bible, and it does. But as we talked about before, this is an obvious mistranslation. The original Greek word there is the word Pascha, which means Passover. The King James translators translated Pascha correctly to Passover 29 times. But the one time, there in Acts 12, verse 4, it was mistranslated as Easter. I checked my other 11 English translations of the Bible, and every single one of them had the correct translation of Pascha as Passover. So, other than that one translation error in the King James, Easter is not mentioned anywhere in our Bibles. No, the holy day and the traditions of Easter have been added to the worship of our Creator. I know people sometimes argue that rabbits multiply rapidly and represent new life. Eggs are also associated with a new birth and new life. And there are some that will say that this new life represents our new life with Jesus Christ. But a much more direct analog would be one of fertility and literal physical new life. We can always make up our own comparisons about physical things that might somehow relate to some aspect of Christ or his ways. But then we would not be following God's commandments if we place our human reasoning into his worship. And if that worked, we really would have no need for God's commandments or his instructions at all. We wouldn't really need our Bibles. We would just do whatever seems right to us. But Proverbs 14, verse 12 tells us, "There is a way which seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death." The death being spoken of here is a permanent death. Now, we certainly don't want that. No, we need to stick with our Bibles and worship our Creator in the ways he commands us to. So, how did Easter Sunday and these traditions of Easter come to be added to the worship of God? Well, since Easter was never commanded by God, we really can't use the Bible to support the holiday of Easter. However, I believe we can use our Bibles and some historical writings to connect the dots and come up with a very strong case for the actual origin of Easter. So please bear with me here. We're going somewhere. Now, the Old Testament speaks about many false gods and goddesses. For false gods, we had Chemos and Dagon, Ammon, Molech, and Tammuz. All these false gods were abominations to the one true God. Now, that's just a partial list. There were many more false gods listed in the Old Testament. There are also many different goddesses in the Old Testament that were abominations to God as well. Here's some examples of false goddesses in the Old Testament. We have Asherah, Ashtoreth, and Amalek. We read about the Queen of Heaven, also known as Ishtar. And these were all known as fertility goddesses. The one peculiar thing about these false gods and goddesses is they typically came in the form of a trinity. There were three. They came as a father god, a mother goddess, and a son of God in these false religions. I'd like to give you some examples from different cultures across the globe. I'll be reading the father god, followed by the mother goddess, and then their son of God. Again, there were three per culture. For example, the Phoenicians had Dagon, Astarte, and Bacchus. The Babylonians had Marduk, Ishtar, and Tammuz. The Egyptians had Osiris, Isis, and Horus. The Romans had Jupiter, Diana, remember Diana, and Cupid. The Greeks had Zeus, Artemis, remember Artemis, and Aphrodite. Again, note that the Roman goddess was Diana, and Artemis was the Greeks' goddess. Hang on to that thought for a second. Of course, there are many other false gods and goddesses found in our Bibles. But let's turn to Acts chapter 19, if you would. That's Acts chapter 19, we'll go to verse 23. Acts chapter 19, verse 23. And let's read about Diana of the Ephesians. She was a false goddess. Now, Ephesus was located in Rome. As I said, Diana was the mother goddess of the Romans. Now, Paul was preaching that Diana was a false goddess, and the people there didn't like to hear that. They were worshiping her. Now, for one thing, there were silversmiths that were making good money from making idols of the goddess Diana and selling them. But, no goddess, no idols, no profit. That wouldn't be good for them. Paul was teaching the people there to worship the one true God and to stop making these idols of Diana. But to the silversmiths, this was bad for business. Again, Acts 19, verse 23. Here we see Paul stirring up trouble with those idol-worshiping Ephesians. Again, Acts 19:23. And the same time there arose no small stir about that way. The Contemporary English Version reads, at that time there was serious trouble because of the Lord's way. The people did not want to hear about the Lord's way from Paul. They wanted to keep the status quo, their idol worship. Verse 24. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana. I'll stop for a second, but these were idols. Actually, many of these were models of the temple they dedicated to their goddess Diana, by the way. That was pretty popular in those days. Anyway, they brought no small gain into the craftsmen. In other words, these idols generated a lot of money for these craftsmen. That was their livelihood. Verse 25. Whom he, that's Demetrius the silversmith, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation and said, sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, you see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away much people, saying that there be no gods which are made with hands. Yes, Paul was going all over the place, preaching to the people that idols and the false gods they worshipped were really no gods at all. Let's see what else Demetrius had to say in verse 27. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, or to go away, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worships. So not only were they afraid their business would be negatively impacted, but also people might actually turn away from their false goddess. That would be bad, wouldn't it? But we might notice here that they claimed that Diana was being worshipped throughout all of Asia and the world, according to verse 27. Now, verse 28. And when they heard these sayings, in other words, what Paul was preaching, they were full of wrath, they were angry, and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Now, different cultures had different names for their trinity of gods and goddesses. If you got a copy of Strong's Bible Dictionary, please look up the definition of the name Diana here, where it's found in Acts chapter 19. I looked it up, and here's what I found. The definition from Strong's Dictionary is this. It's Artemis, the name of a Grecian goddess borrowed by the Asiatics for one of their deities, or Diana. Thayer's Bible Dictionary simply says that Diana is known to the Greeks as Artemis. My point is that all these ancient cultures worshiping a trinity of two gods and a goddess wasn't just a huge coincidence. I believe these false trios of two gods and a goddess located throughout the world likely had a common origin. Let's turn over to Genesis, if you would, please. That's Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8, as we get into this a little bit. Now, I suspect that these two gods and a goddess all came from the same place, way, way back in history. But if that's true, then why all the different names? And how did this false religion spread throughout the world? Again, Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. Now, this is just after the great flood. The descendants of Noah were repopulating the earth. Now, Noah had three sons. They were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Cush was the son of Ham. Again, Genesis 10, verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod. That makes Nimrod Noah's great-grandson. So, Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, before the Lord is better translated against the Lord. The International Standard Version reads, he, Nimrod, became a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. The legend has it that it was he, Nimrod, that started this false religion of the two gods and a goddess, beginning with declaring himself to be a god, in defiance, of course, of the Lord. Verse 10. In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. These cities were all in the basic same area. The people weren't really spreading out throughout the earth. They were kind of stuck there in that one spot. Let's move ahead to the next chapter. That's Genesis 11, of course. We'll begin there in verse 1. Genesis 11, verse 1. And remember, this was shortly after the flood, and all of Noah's immediate descendants spoke the same language. You know, they would have. Again, Genesis 11, verse 1. We read that here. And the whole earth was one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now, God had previously said that man was to replenish and fill the earth. But here it seems the people wanted to settle into a certain area and not spread over all the earth, as God had said. Verse 3. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So here in verse 4, it seems the people wanted to stay together in one place, lest they be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. But that wasn't God's will. God wanted them to spread out and fill the earth. Verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men built. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. But God wasn't pleased with what they were doing here. Verse 7. How did God react? Go to, let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Now, suddenly, the people all spoke different languages, and they spread all across the earth. When they did, they took the false religion that developed there in Babel, the false religion of the Father God, the Mother Goddess, and the Son of that Father God. Now, what were the names of those two false gods and the single goddess? Well, it depended on the language. There are many languages now. God causes the people to speak in different languages and scattered them across the earth, taking those two gods and a goddess with them, although they now had different names. Different names just as I read earlier to you. Verse 9. Therefore the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. The two gods and a goddess we've seen in the various cultures very likely came from the same source. And that's very likely the kingdom of Babel, where Nimrod was a mighty hunter, but against or in defiance of the true God. But what does this have to do with Easter? Well, over time, these different peoples, now with different languages, were somewhat isolated from each other because of their speech. These two false gods and goddess became known by many different names. But they were still basically the same old false deities as before, and all were abominations to the one true God. Now, one title given to the false goddess, otherwise known as Diana, Artemis, Ishtar, in many of their names was the Queen of Heaven. We can find this title of the mother goddess 21 times in 5 different verses of our Bibles. Turn to Jeremiah with me, if you would. That'll be Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah chapter 7, we'll go to verse 18. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 18. Notice what the people were doing to worship this false goddess. A goddess that was worshipped under many different names depending on the culture. Now, one such name was Ishtar. Again, Jeremiah 7, verse 18. The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven, to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. Now, making cakes for the Queen of Heaven was one way the heathen worshiped their false goddess. I'd like to quote from an article located at thefirmament.net. Quote, "It is no coincidence that Ishtar, one of the many goddesses called the Queen of Heaven, is phonetically identical with Easter. In Jeremiah 7, verse 17, God specifically points to the pagan practice of making cakes to the Queen of Heaven. This baking practice has a direct connection to Easter today, known as hot cross buns. Furthermore, the rabbits and eggs associated with Easter are obvious fertility symbols, which you would expect from a fertility goddess. it should be obvious that eggs and rabbits have nothing to do with Jesus or his mother. God was clearly referring to the worship practices of Easter in Jeremiah 7. End quote. Well, it would seem clear that Easter, just another name for the Queen of Heaven and known to be a fertility goddess, would indeed be associated with fertility symbols such as rabbits and eggs. But how did this false goddess, the Queen of Heaven, Ashtoreth, Ishtar, or Easter, come to be celebrated as the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, since we can't look to the Bible for the origin of the holiday known as Easter, let's look to another source. Now, one such source might be the discovery of ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets dating back to 2100 BC. Now, these obviously predate the resurrection of Christ by thousands of years. I'd like to read to you about this discovery. This article can be found, by the way, at ancientorigins.net. That's ancient-origins.net. This is interesting. Quote, according to some scholars, such as Dr. Tony Nugent, teacher of theology and religious studies at Seattle University and Presbyterian minister, the Easter story comes from the Sumerian legend of Dumuzi, Tammuz. Both words are there in the quote. Dumuzi, in parenthesis, Tammuz, and his wife, Inanna, Ishtar. I'd like to stop here for just a second. Now, Dumuzi is more commonly known as the false god Tammuz, as Dr. Nugent points out to us. I mentioned earlier that Tammuz is the Roman version of that false son of God. Dr. Nugent also points out that Dumuzi's wife, Inanna, is also known as Ishtar. And of course, Ishtar and Easter are one and the same. Just a slightly different spelling based on the culture. So keep in mind that we're talking about the more familiar Tammuz and Easter as I read this. A false god and a false goddess. Let's start over again. Quote, the Easter story comes from the Sumerian legend of Dumuzi, Tammuz, and his wife Inanna, Ishtar, an epic myth called the Descent of Inanna, found inscribed on cuneiform clay tablets dating back to 2100 BC. All right, here we go. When Tammuz dies, Ishtar, or the goddess Easter, is grief-stricken and follows him to the underworld. In the underworld, she enters through 7 gates, and her worldly attire is removed. Stop here for a second. Remember that Satan has a good idea of what God's plans are, through Scripture for one thing. Now, creating a false Jesus Christ would be a good way for him to strike first, we might say, and then maintain that his false deity was the real one. When Christ came, Christ might be considered the counterfeit of Tammuz. Actually, the purpose, I believe, of all those false gods in the Old Testament was to provide a counterfeit of Jesus Christ as well as our Heavenly Father. And then it also appears Satan threw in a mother goddess while he was at it. But back to the article. Notice the similarities between Easter, the goddess Easter, and Jesus Christ as we continue. Okay? In the underworld, she enters through 7 gates, and her worldly attire is removed. Naked and bowed low, she is judged, killed, and then hung on display. Now, counterfeits by definition are not perfect, but does this remind us of someone else? Someone like Jesus Christ? He was judged, although falsely. He was stripped of his raiment, and then he was killed. And he was hung on display for all to see. Coincidence? Remember that the descent of Inanna, or Easter, was written over 2,000 years before Jesus Christ, before he came to earth. Let's continue. In her, Easter's absence, the earth loses its fertility. Crops cease to grow, and animals stop reproducing. Unless something is done, all life on earth will end. After Inanna, Easter, has been missing for 3 days. 3 days? Christ was also missing for 3 days. He was in his tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. Again, a coincidence or a counterfeit? Back to the article. After Inanna has been missing for 3 days, her assistant goes to other gods for help. Finally, one of them, Enki, creates 2 creatures who carry the plant of life and water of life down to the underworld, sprinkling. Now, is this sprinkling the possible origin of sprinkling for baptism that some churches do rather than total immersion that the Bible actually teaches? I don't know. Let's continue. Sprinkling them on Inanna, Easter, and Tammuz, Tammuz, resurrecting them, and giving them the power to return to the earth as the light of the sun for 6 months. So, both Easter and Tammuz were said to be resurrected at the exact same time. Keep that in mind. But when were they resurrected? Well, they return as the light of the sun for 6 months. They return for the light half of the year. And the light half of the year begins in the spring. And so does our modern date of Easter. Another coincidence? Continue in the article. After the 6 months are up, Tammuz returns to the underworld of the dead, remaining there for another 6 months, and Ishtar, or Easter, pursues him, prompting the water god to rescue them both. Thus were the cycles of winter, death, and spring life. So every spring, Easter and Tammuz are resurrected anew according to these ancient writings. They're resurrected together on the holy day of Easter. I think we understand about the fertility symbols of the false fertility goddess Easter, such as the rabbit and the eggs. But what about the worship of Tammuz? Now, Easter is said to be the day of his resurrection, too. We'll get to that. There's more to the story, so hang on. Back to the article. Dr. Nugent is quick to point out that drawing parallels between the story of Jesus and the epic of Inanna, Easter, doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a real person, Jesus, who was crucified, but rather that if there was, notice the if there was, do we see the doubt this ancient myth is casting on the validity of Jesus Christ? Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a real person, Jesus, who was crucified, but rather that if there was, the story of Christ, is structured and embellished in accordance with a pattern that was very ancient and widespread, end quote. In other words, to put it simply, Jesus is just another copy, just another version of these former false gods. His story is structured or patterned on the former gods who we all know really aren't gods at all. Therefore, neither is he. See how this works? Do we see how clever Satan can be with his counterfeits and his deception? It's amazing. I'd like to quote from an article located at SabbathCovenant.com. Quote, Semiramis became known as the fertility goddess Ishtar. She took on many names in different cultures, including Isis, Diana, Astarte, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Venus, and Easter. She was even identified with Mary, as Mary was falsely deified and took on the titles Mother of God and Queen of Heaven. Her son, Tammuz, took on many names as well, such as Horus, Apollo, Saul, Krishna, Hercules, Mithra, and finally, Jesus. The name Jesus H. Christ, in fact, originated by Constantine as Jesus Horus Krishna. Jesus Horus Krishna evolved into Jesus H. Christ over the years, end quote. You know, I always wondered where that H came from. I guess now we know. And now that we know the origins of Easter, how did Christians end up observing it? Well, back when the Roman Emperor Constantine was uniting the Roman Empire, he melded the different religions of Rome's conquered lands into one, a single universal religion. Now, those worshiping the false gods and goddess Easter, known also by their names, were very similar in the manner of worship. Again, I believe they had the same origin anyway. So, but all they had to do was decide which name would be used. But the Christians didn't observe Easter at the time. They observed the Passover. With the majority of the Roman Empire then observing Easter and keeping the Passover by Roman law ended up having the penalty of death, Easter was then kept, and Passover was abandoned throughout the empire. Now, some Christians and a whole lot of Jews fled rather than change their religious practice. But that's what happened. It's really that simple. Even today, most churches continue to observe Easter even though it is not commanded anywhere in our Bibles. Even though it honors a false fertility goddess with its bunnies and eggs. But what about that false god Tammuz we talked about? And we saw earlier that both Easter and Tammuz were resurrected at the same time in the spring. And we have the bunnies and the eggs to worship, the goddess Easter, but what about Tammuz? Are modern Christians worshiping him? Or was he forgotten about when Christianity embraced the pagan Easter? Let's turn to Ezekiel, if you would. Let's take a look at this. That's Ezekiel chapter 8, and we'll begin right there in verse 1. That's Ezekiel chapter 8. So while most Christians today are celebrating the false goddess Easter, at Easter, how are they honoring Tammuz, the false god also resurrected on Easter? Again, Ezekiel 8, verse 1. Here God showed Ezekiel some very disgusting things here. Let's take a look. Ezekiel 8:1. And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord fell there upon me. Skip down to verse 4. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain. Then said he to me, Son of man, lift up your eyes now the way toward the north. So lifted up my eyes the way toward the north. And behold, northward at the gate of the altar, this image of jealousy in the entry. The contemporary English version reads, God said to me, Ezekiel, son of man, look north. And when I did, I saw that disgusting idol by the altar near the gate. Now, this disgusting idol was just the beginning of the abominations to God that these Israelites were involved in. So let's go ahead, verse 6. He said, furthermore to me, Son of man, see you what they do? Even the great abominations that the house of Israel commits here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary. And turn you yet again, and you shall see greater abominations. As we read here in Ezekiel chapter 8, these abominations are getting worse and worse. Verse 7. He brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. Then said he to me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold, a door. He said to me, Go in, and behold the wicked abominations they do here. And God showed Ezekiel even more things the people were doing that were an abomination to him. Drop down to verse 12. Verse 12. Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the chambers of his imagery? For they say, The Lord sees us not. The Lord has forsaken the earth. Today, I suspect many Christians might feel the same way, if maybe subconsciously. God doesn't see us. He doesn't really pay attention to us when we abandon his commandments and worship in the ways of the heathen, have idols, things like that. It's just like Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. But God does see us. Verse 13. He said also to me, turn you yet again, and you shall see greater abominations that they do. I'd say things are getting really bad now. We're about to see even greater abominations to God. These are things he really hates. Verse 14. What is this abomination? This really bad abomination. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Now, why were these women weeping for Tammuz? Many translations say they were mourning for the false god Tammuz, but the Bible doesn't really tell us why. Now, legend holds that Tammuz was the false god, 40 years old when he was killed by a wild boar. His followers would weep for him for 40 days and then kill and eat a pig to celebrate his resurrection. The 40 days is, of course, one day for every year that Tammuz lived until his resurrection each spring on Easter. Today, this very well might be what we know as the 40 days of Lent. This might also explain the tradition of the Easter ham, reminiscent of the wild boar that killed Tammuz as a human and allowed him to become a god, albeit a false one, of course. But wait, there's more abominations to God that are even greater still. We're not done yet. Verse 15. This is getting really bad now. Verse 15. Then said he to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn you yet again, and you shall see greater abominations than these. I think we're running off the scale with these abominations. These are really getting bad. Something God really detests. So what is it here that is really getting God angry? Let's see. Verse 16. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord. So these men were there at the temple of the Lord. Ordinarily, I would think this would be a good thing, right? They're there at the temple. But their backs were toward the temple. What were they doing? Let's go back and read from verse 16. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east. And they worshiped the sun toward the east. So let's picture this in our minds. These men had their backs turned to God's temple. They were facing the rising sun. They got on their knees with their faces to the ground, worshiping that rising sun. Not only were they worshiping the sun, which of course is forbidden, but they had turned their backsides to God, which was all disgusting to him, I'm sure. But why would they do this? Well, the false god Tammuz is said to be resurrected every year on the day we know as Easter. And Tammuz is known as a sun god. In fact, most ancient pagan worship involved the worship of the sun. That's what they did. Legend has it that when Tammuz was killed as a human, he went to the sun where he became a sun god. And that explains why those men with their backs to the temple were worshiping the rising sun. They were in fact worshiping the false god Tammuz on the annual day of his resurrection as the sun rose. As their sun god rose or was resurrected from the dead. And 40 days prior, the women were weeping for Tammuz. Today we call this worship of the false god and goddess Lent and Easter. Now, how did God feel about the worship of a false god and goddess back then? Let's continue in verse 17. See what he says to Ezekiel here. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence, and returned to provoke me to anger. And lo, they put the branch to their nose. The Contemporary English Version reads, they have disgraced and insulted me in the worst possible way. Verse 18. Therefore will I also deal in fury. My eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. God is not pleased with those who claim to worship him, but do so in the manner of the heathen. Many who worship the rising sun on Easter claim that somehow the rising sun represents the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But, first, Jesus is not a sun god, like all the pagan gods of our past, including that false god Tammuz. Second, Jesus was not resurrected at the rising of the sun. It wasn't him. If you would turn to John with me, John chapter 20, we'll begin right at the beginning in verse 1. That's John chapter 20. I think we all recall that Jesus said he would be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights and be raised on the third day. Now we know he died around the 9th hour, or around 3 p.m. in the afternoon as we measure time today. He was placed in his tomb right before sundown. 72 hours later, he would be resurrected at the same time of day that he was placed in his tomb. That would be right before dark, 3 days and 3 nights later. There's no scriptural evidence that supports Jesus' resurrection at sunrise. But there is scripture that shows Christ's resurrection occurred well before the sun came up on Sunday. Again, that's John 20, verse 1. This is regarding Jesus' resurrection. The first day of the week, that will be a Sunday, came Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark. It was still dark, under the sepulchre, and saw the stone taken away from the sepulchre. At this point, it was dark. The sun was not rising. It was not sunrise. And Mary saw the stone rolled away from the tomb already. That's because Jesus was not in his tomb. He'd been resurrected, just as he said, 3 days and 3 nights after he was placed in his tomb right before sunset. Verse 2. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre. We know not where they have laid him. That was because he wasn't there. He'd been resurrected. While it was yet dark, Mary came to the tomb and found it empty. That's because Jesus had already been resurrected. Now, since it was still dark when Mary arrived at the tomb and found it empty, it's impossible for Jesus to have been resurrected at daybreak at the rising sun. The Bible contradicts that completely. But now we know who was allegedly resurrected at sunrise. Both the false goddess Easter and the false god Tammuz. The Easter Sunday sunrise service honors the resurrection of the false god Tammuz, and likely the false goddess Easter as well. We saw that God was not pleased when those in Jerusalem were worshiping idols, when they were weeping for the false god Tammuz for 40 days, and when they worshiped the rising sun, their sun god. God called these great abominations and said he would not hear the people's cries. He would not have pity on them. He would not spare them. That's not good. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12, if you would. I get my voice back here. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 29. That's Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29. What does God tell his people about following the ways of those who follow false gods? Again, that's Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 29. When the Lord your God shall cut off the nations from before you, these are idol-worshipping pagan nations, where you go to possess them, and you succeed them, and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you be not ensnared by following them. We don't want to do the same things that caused God to wipe these people out in the first place. We don't want to follow their bad example, that's for sure. Again, verse 30. Take heed to yourself that you be not snared by following them after that they be destroyed from before you, and that you inquire not after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so, I will do likewise. And likewise, this is exactly what people do when they observe the customs of Easter. When they color and hunt for Easter eggs, or pass out Easter baskets with bunnies and eggs, symbols of the fertility goddess Easter. When they worship the rising sun at sunrise, honoring Tammuz on Easter. God considers these practices to be an abomination to him, whether we claim to be worshiping him or not. Turn next, if you would, to Exodus chapter 23 as we wind down here. That's Exodus chapter 23, verse 13. Exodus 23, verse 13. Now, while we're turning, I'd like to remind us that in the very first of the Ten Commandments, in Exodus 20, verse 3, God tells us, you shall have no other gods before me. We should have nothing to do with any other gods or goddesses other than the one true God. This worshiping in the manner of the heathen is a very serious offense to God. It is indeed a great abomination to him. It's so bad, God doesn't even want us to mention the names of any of these false deities, let alone worship in their manner. Again, Exodus 23, verse 13. These are God's instructions to us. Here's what he says. And in all things that I have said to you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of your mouth. The English Standard Version reads, pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, neither let it be heard on your lips. The very name, Easter, is the name of a false goddess. Now, you're wondering why I'm using the term, right? Well, I'm trusting that God will understand that I am not glorifying these false gods and goddesses, but rather condemning them. Now, the names of gods and goddesses I'm speaking of today, as well as many others, are listed in our Bibles, where they're condemned but never praised. God tells us the names of these false gods should not even be in our lips. So, how is it that people professing to be Christians or followers of Jesus Christ, the majority of Christianity today, would do the very things that God tells us are abominations to him? How can that be? Now, one answer might be found in Revelation 12, verse 9, that describes Satan as that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4 tells us that the god of this world, Satan, has blinded the minds of them which believe not. Now think about this. How many of us have colored Easter eggs and hunted for Easter eggs in the grass? How many of us gave our children Easter baskets with chocolate bunnies and marshmallow peeps? I did that. How many of us have attended Easter sunrise services? So if we answered yes to either or both of these questions, why did we do it? Well, in most cases, it was because we didn't know any better at the time. We really thought that we were somehow glorifying our Creator by doing these things. We weren't really sure how, but we had been deceived by our church, by our parents, and by our friends who didn't know any better, and by Satan who should know better. But now that Satan's deception has been revealed to us, we can and should follow our Bibles and worship our great God in spirit and in truth, abandoning the fables and worshiping the one true God in the way He desires for us to worship Him, in the way He asks us to show our love to Him. Let's conclude for today. Outside of a translation error, a single translation error in the King James Bible, the word Easter is never found in our Bibles. There's no command to observe it. There's no commandment to color eggs or hunt for Easter eggs. There's no commandment to worship the rising sun on Easter Sunday. Turns out that Jesus was not resurrected on the Sunday morning of sunrise. He was found to have been resurrected and out of his tomb while it was yet dark on that first day of the week. God does not command us to keep Easter anywhere in our Bibles. Rather, He condemns it. Easter is all about the worship of the false fertility goddess Easter. The bunnies and the eggs are symbols of the fertility goddess Easter, and they're really a dead giveaway. Watching the rising sun on Easter Sunday morning is not consistent with the worship of Jesus Christ. Rather, this is an ancient custom that worships the false god Tammuz and the false goddess Easter, as they're both said to be resurrected at sunrise. God tells us over and over again in His Holy Bible that we're to never worship in the ways of the heathen, and we're never to add to or take away from God's holy commandments. Now that we know the heathen origins of Easter, we should no longer observe it. It's clearly an abomination to God. Instead, at this time of year, we should observe Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because these are clearly commanded by our great God in our Bibles. And unlike the rabbits and eggs of Easter and watching the rising sun, God's real holy days have great meaning for us. They teach us of God's great mercy and His great plan of salvation for us. So this year, we invite you all to join us as we'll be preparing for the observation of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We hope you will join us beginning next week as we prepare for God's commanded holy days.